Thank you. And you're the prodigal son, I'm telling you.
Well, that part's true. That part's true. Governor, sit down. The gavel.
More the chaos. You know, if I knew we could go both sides, I would have brought
You know you can.
The problem is the ones I have are all really gaudy.
Well,
I'm
that's
so sorry.
never stopped you before.
How are you?
Actually,
Good to see you. Good job on TV this morning. All right, you ready? The Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Border and Maritime Security will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to examine the impact an unsecure border has on the opioid crisis. Before we proceed any further, as chair, I need to make a few important announcements. It takes a tremendous amount of work putting this hearing together, and I appreciate the interest that is shown by the number of people who are in attendance today. I'd also like to thank the University of Arizona for hosting us today and for allowing us to use this excellent facility. Because this is an official congressional hearing, as opposed to a town hall meeting, we must abide by certain rules of the Committee on Homeland Security and the House of Representatives. I kindly wish to remind our guests today that demonstrations from the audience, including applause, verbal outbursts, as well as the use of signs or placards, are a violation of the rules of the House of Representatives. It's important we respect the decorum and the rules of the committee. I'd also like to remind everybody that photography and cameras are limited to accredited press only. I also ask unanimous consent that Mr. Schweikert, Ms. Lesko, Mr. Grijalva, Ms. Sinema, and Mr. Gallego be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Opioid abuse has become an epidemic across the entire nation, affecting all 50 states. 115 Americans die every single day from an opioid overdose. These victims come from all walks of life. They're teachers, business professionals, ranchers, students, government officials, and retirees. And here in Arizona, there's been at least 800 lives lost just last year alone. Some estimates conclude that more than 2 million of our fellow Americans are addicted to opioids. Chances are, every single one of us knows someone struggling with opioid dependence. No state, no neighborhood, no socioeconomic group, no family is immune from the destruction and carnage that it brings. Too many lives have been lost, too many families have been destroyed, and communities all over the nation are asking what more can be done to stop this devastating opioid addiction epidemic. I've called this hearing today to not only highlight the crisis, but to discuss both law enforcement and non-law enforcement solutions that will ultimately save lives. Thankfully, this is not a partisan issue. I'm grateful to see my colleagues today, both Republicans and Democrats, so we can work together to identify the challenges and enact solutions to help families in our communities. Actions to address this crisis will require multiple state, federal, local, tribal governments to work together and in concert with nonprofit entities and the faith-based community. No one can go it alone because this issue will require a whole-of-society approach. Addiction often begins after powerful opioids are routinely prescribed out of a genuine need to manage pain after surgery. However, patients quickly become hooked, often unaware of how addicting they are. In addition, even after the risks were well known, unethical doctors continue to write prescription after prescription, becoming pill mills that now sustain the flow of opioids to those who are addicted. Last year, 4 of Arizona's top opioid prescribing doctors were located in the sparsely populated Mojave County. Together, they wrote prescriptions for nearly 6 million pills over a 12-month period. An unsecure border enables and exacerbates this crisis by providing a strong supply of illicit versions. Securing the border is more than just stopping illicit movement of people and contraband between the ports of entry, which is often a focus. But since I've been chair of this committee, I've also focused on modernizing infrastructure, technology, and additional manpower at the nation's ports of entry. In fact, my first bill signed into law was fast-tracking our veterans for these critical manning positions at the ports. It's well known that the overwhelming majority of drugs, maybe as high as 90%, that enter our country come through the nation's ports of entry, such as the ones in Nogales and Douglas. Illicit opioids are no exception. Deep concealment within vehicles or in cargo is the preferred method of the drug cartels, and they are very successful despite the best efforts of the men and women in U.S. Customs and Border Protection. To ensure the speedy movement of commerce that powers our economy, we can only X-ray a fraction of the vehicles and trucks that cross the border every day. We need more detection equipment and more tools for CBP to effectively combat the illicit drug flow hidden in legitimate travel and commerce. I'm proud to announce I'll be hosting the Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary Nielsen, tomorrow at 2 of our ports of entry, Douglas and Nogales, so she can see firsthand the needs we have at these ports in Arizona. I've been a tireless advocate for the expansion and modernization of Douglas, not just because of its importance to economic growth, but because of its importance to security. In addition to the challenges at the ports, fentanyl, an opioid 100 times stronger than morphine, is being produced illicitly in large quantities, chiefly in China, but also increasingly in Mexico. The primary smuggling route from China and into the U.S. is through our mail system, where vulnerabilities in the postal system are exploited. In order to mitigate these illicit pathways, we must secure the border and strengthen our postal system. In addition, we got to increase detection capabilities of law enforcement on every level as they respond to the disaster. However, that's just one part of the solution. Law enforcement and increased border security alone will never be enough. We cannot enforce our way out of this problem. We must also tackle the crisis with treatment and recovery options that help restore individuals to health and break the cycle of addiction. Educating patients on the risks of taking properly prescribed opioids must be standard medical practice. With respect to those doctors who unethically prescribe those medications, they must be held accountable. And most of all, we must support all those who suffer from addiction, their families and their loved ones, to ensure they get the help they so desperately need. I'm very proud to say the state of Arizona has been a national leader in addressing these challenges head-on. Faced with a growing crisis, Governor Ducey declared the opioid crisis a public health emergency in June last year. Then the governor called a 4-day special session of the state legislature at the beginning of this year and signed the Arizona Opioid Epidemic Act. Legislation takes aggressive steps to address opioid addiction, hold bad actors accountable, expand access to treatment, and provide life-saving resources to first responders, law enforcement, and community partners. On the federal level, Congress has been engaged in tackling this problem as well. Legislation that passed the Homeland Security Committee and later became law provide additional fentanyl and synthetic opioid detection equipment to the frontline CBP officers in the Interdict Act. Over the last few months, 57 bills that address this public health crisis are making their way through the House of Representatives. These bills provide new authority to spur urgently needed research on new non-addictive pain medications, ensure medical professionals have access to consenting patients' complete health history when making treatment decisions, provide resources for hospitals to develop protocols for discharging patients who are presented with an opioid overdose, establish comprehensive opioid recovery centers that will serve as models for comprehensive treatment and recovery, and direct the FDA to work with manufacturers to establish programs for efficient return or destruction of unused opioids. And the fiscal year 2018 appropriations bill provided over $4 billion in funding for the development of opioid alternatives, grants for states to respond to the challenge, new funds for equipment to inspect more incoming mail packages, as well as more X-ray devices at the ports of entry. This is a complicated and multifaceted problem. There are no quick or easy solutions. I've invited witnesses today who deal with this issue from many different angles to testify. On the following panels, we'll hear from law enforcement, border security experts, as well as experienced professionals from the public sector, those with a family member or were themselves addicted or found the support they needed to get and stay clean. I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses today as we search for solutions to this grave crisis that affects too many of our fellow Americans. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, for any statement he may have.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and my appreciation to all the panelists that are going to give testimony today and respond to the questions from my colleagues. The subcommittee hearing that the chair stated is entitled "An Unsecure Border and the Opioid Crisis and the Urgent Need for Action to Save Lives." Saving lives, indeed, with a daily death toll of 116 in this country from overdoses and increasing addiction and usage of opioids, both prescription and illicit, continues to grow in this country. The deaths and addictions have shattered lives, shattered families, led to more incarcerations, and the economic and community losses are dire in this not only in our state of Arizona but across the country. It's tragic here and it's tragic everywhere. So I believe, as the reason for this hearing, saving lives must be the focus. I wonder, Madam Chair, why we don't have a top-level pharmaceutical CEO here to give testimony as to their role in igniting the demand and use of prescription opioids, and what are they doing to assist us in stemming this demand and this use? And I hope that in this hearing, because the premise is to save lives, that we don't politicize the real crisis with fanciful demands and proclamations about walls that cost $30 billion, about a maximum minimum sentencing as a deterrent, including the death penalty, as was mentioned by the Attorney General, or spend time, all the time of this hearing, blaming all immigrants and undocumented people, including moms and children, as the cause for this crisis. I think leaving that rhetorical political posturing aside, it would be important, and to talk honestly and realistically about the demand and use, cause and prevention, and treatment. The ports of entry where over 80% of land seizures on opioids have occurred, have been historically underfunded in terms of personnel, understaffed, and with less than the optimum technology and infrastructure, as was outlined by the chair, that's needed in that border. All bipartisan letters have gone to Homeland Security, to this administration, by both senators and a bipartisan group of congressmen from Arizona, time and time again, to ask for additional resources to deal with the people in blue with the same emphasis as we're dealing with Border Patrol and ICE. Since 57% of the seizures in this country occur between San Diego and Tucson, it would only seem logical that that should be a focus. And I think we need to involve, and we need a strategy that provides a singular focus on this issue. A strategy to deal with the organized and wealthy crime syndicates whose market is the United States of America, where 5% of the population consumes over 80% of the opioids, be it prescription or illegal. And yes, saving lives, hopefully, is what this hearing is about. Securing the border with fanciful proclamations said is not going to deal with this issue. We have to save lives. It's going to require hard work. It's going to require cooperation across lines and across political parties. I'm prepared to do that hard work. And at this point, Madam Chair, the remaining time I would yield to my colleague, Congresswoman Sinema, for the time left on my opening statement.
Thank you, Congressman Grijalva, for yielding a moment of time, and thank you to Chairwoman McSally for holding this field hearing. Like all Arizonans, we share a commitment to a more secure border and to addressing the opioid crisis. Washington needs to get serious about taking action. In the past year, more than 8,000 Arizonans overdosed on opiates. Over 1,200 of those lives couldn't be saved. Congresswoman McSally, we've worked together to help stop the flow of dangerous drugs into our communities. We've offered 3 bills together to identify the greatest threats to Arizona's border, improve deployment of new border technologies, and prevent spotters who facilitate illegal crossings. We've also worked across the aisle to support and pass the recent government funding bill, which invests billions in border security resources, including counter-drug missions, and in treatment, prevention, and law enforcement efforts targeting the opioid crisis. It's important that we put politics aside so we can protect and help Arizona communities and families. Our work should support efforts at the state level to win this fight. Recently, I co-introduced the PASS Act with Republican Congressman Roscom to help doctors cut down on overprescribing and to help Arizonans better manage their medications. My bipartisan bill, which is expected on the House floor in June, reinforces the great work done by Governor Ducey and the state legislature through the Arizona Opioid Epidemic Act. I look forward to continuing to work with everyone here today to protect our communities, secure our border, and address the opioid crisis. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman yields back. We're honored in our first panel today to have Governor Ducey. Governor Doug Ducey became the governor of Arizona in January 2015. Previously, he served as Arizona's 32nd state treasurer, a position he held since his appointment in January 2011. Mr. Ducey, Governor Ducey, joined Procter & Gamble and began a career in sales and marketing. There he was trained in management, preparing him for his role as a partner and CEO of Cold Stone Creamery. Governor Ducey also served as the chairman of Arizona State's Board of Investment and State Loans Commission. I now recognize Governor Ducey to testify.
Chairwoman McSally, Congressman Grijalva, distinguished members of the subcommittee, and other members in attendance. Thank you for this opportunity to appear before you discuss one of the most significant public health and safety emergencies our nation and the state of Arizona has faced in a generation. The opioid crisis and the interrelated priority of securing our nation's border. Let's start with the need to secure the border. From the earliest days of my administration, I've had the opportunity to spend time with Arizona's border sheriffs and numerous everyday residents, citizens, and ranchers in our border communities. The concerns they have expressed for their safety and the security are real, and it's our job to listen and take action. I'm grateful for the strong partnerships our state has with local law enforcement, and we've established these as well with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security over these many years. In 2015, Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, was in town helping to coordinate security efforts for the Super Bowl. We had such great success working together that I thought, why can't we continue this type of collaboration to also secure our border? Working with that cooperative spirit in partnership with the Department of Homeland Security, in 2015, we established the Arizona Border Strike Force. This interagency team has, without a doubt, made Arizona and our entire country safer. One example of many large-scale efforts by the Border Strike Force is Operation Organ Grinder, which resulted in the seizure of more than 4,000 pounds of marijuana and the arrest of 73 felons. To date, the Border Strike Force has kept 15.3 million hits of heroin off our streets. And it's not just drugs. What began as a traffic stop in Cochise County led to the discovery of a juvenile runaway who was the victim of horrific sex trafficking crimes. The primary suspect was sentenced to 20 years in prison and will face a lifetime of supervised probation and sex offender registration. We are grateful to the new administration for amplifying these efforts even further. President Trump's deployment of the National Guard has brought additional boots on the ground to our border. They are needed and they are welcomed. And both General John Kelly and current DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen have not only visited our state to tour the border with me, they have delivered on both support and resources. They are finally making Washington, D.C. listen. And after recently visiting all 4 of our border counties, I can tell you, the residents in these communities could not be more grateful. When it comes to the opioid epidemic, overdoses and deaths have indeed reached crisis levels. Last year alone, 800 Arizona moms, dads, brothers, sisters, family members, and friends were claimed by this scourge. This is why we are all here today. From across the state, from both political parties, because we've all seen the consequences, and we all know that this is not a partisan issue. The collaborative process under which our plan was developed with stakeholders from across the state and the way Democrats and Republicans came together to pass it unanimously is an example our nation can view of what can be accomplished when we do put politics aside. The public health state of emergency I declared last June began a process of collaboration between the Arizona Department of Health Services, law enforcement, hospitals, medical professionals, addiction specialists, and other community stakeholders to fight this crisis head on. The declaration allowed us to collect information on opioid overdoses, deaths, cases of newborns experiencing withdrawal from opioids, and naloxone use on a 24-hour basis, something no other state has done. From there, our Department of Health Services worked to analyze the data and identify solutions focused on prevention and treatment. Where Arizona is dealing with chronic pain and participating in a responsible treatment plan, we know how critical these medications are. So we made sure that they were involved every step of the way, too. During a special session last January, we addressed every facet of this fight, from the need to protect Good Samaritans and end pill mills, right down to the physical packaging of the drugs themselves. In fact, all opioid prescription bottles in our state will now have red caps to alert patients to the high risk of these drugs and the need to keep them away from children. One of our most significant accomplishments was a result of bipartisan collaboration to improve access to treatment with a $10 million investment that will help uninsured and underinsured people get the treatment they need. Since declaring a state of emergency last June, we've come a long way. In fact, every directive I gave in that declaration has been completed. New reporting and information sharing procedures are now codified in policy and rule. Almost 1,000 law enforcement officers statewide have been trained to provide naloxone. We have also seen a 355% increase in the number of naloxone doses dispensed by pharmacists to communities. Our healthcare institutions now have rules for opioid prescribing and treatment. Arizona opioid prescribing guidelines have been updated and distributed. Our comprehensive opioid Epidemic Act went into effect in Arizona on April 26th, and the 12 recommendations of our opioid action plan will be fully implemented by the end of June. With these items completed, our emergency declaration has served its purpose, and that's not all the positive news we have to report. March and April of 2018 saw a 33% reduction in the number of opioid prescriptions statewide compared to March and April of 2017. Since last June, we've seen a 38% increase in the number of people referred to behavioral health treatment from hospitals after an overdose. Since July of 2017, we've seen a 60% reduction in the number of patients potentially doctor shopping through our CSPMP threshold report. And since this April, over 200 prescribers have utilized our newly established opioid assistance and referral line to get expert advice on treating patients. In addition, we have worked with 100% of Arizona's academic partners who train prescribers to develop a statewide curriculum on opioid prescribing, treatment of opioid use disorder, and management of chronic pain. This could be implemented in our schools as early as this coming fall. We have certainly made progress, but we know that the fight remains deadly and that it is far from over. Continuing to work with each other and across the aisle as we have done, I know this is a fight we can win. Again, thank you for having me here today.
Thanks, Governor Ducey. I really appreciate it. I understand you have a hard stop in just a few minutes, but you're willing to graciously take some of our questions. In order to be mindful of your schedule, we'll reduce the time that each member has to 2 minutes. That means short questions and allowing the time for answers. So, look, you've taken bold action here in Arizona. We appropriated $4 billion this year at the federal level. What else can the federal government do in order to support your efforts in Arizona?
I am proud of the efforts that we were able to take in the state of Arizona on a bipartisan level in terms of urgency and action and thoughtfulness and thoroughness on the opioid epidemic. I do think a wide open and unprotected border is a reality in this state, and law enforcement efforts and coordination along with healthcare professionals and prescribers who understand this epidemic and the scourge that we're fighting in the state will help us continue to improve not only for Arizona but for the rest of the United States, which is where many of these drugs are transported through our state, unfortunately.
Great, thanks. I am going to yield back for time. The chair now recognizes the acting ranking member, Mr. Grijalva.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Governor, for being here. Appreciate it very much. The point of security that you made, and I noted in my opening statement that the overwhelming majority of seizures of opioids entering this country illegally happen at the ports of entry. There's been a persistent issue, especially in Tucson, which and the other ports of entry, a persistent issue of understaffing, persistent issue of not the infrastructure and technology not being up to date, efforts time and time again. As part of the security umbrella that you mentioned in your talk, where do you see ports of entry in this fight?
Mr. Grijalva, I agree with you. I think this is an all-of-the-above solution that we need to bring to this. So it's not only the ports of entry and the brave men and women that wear the blue shirts in our federal government, it's also the border agents and the people that wear the green shirts. You are talking about the amount of drugs that are seized at the ports of entry, and that is a fact. But what we don't know are about the drugs that are not seized and that are getting to our cities and streets and high schools across the country. Those are ones that are somehow either evading the technology that's at the port of entry, or it is coming through the borders. So I would be for an all-of-the-above approach in terms of law enforcement.
Yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentleman kneels back. Schweikert for 2 minutes.
Governor Ducey, I always have to break the habit of not calling you Doug. And look, your office has always been incredibly good reaching out to ours when we're working on, the reimbursements, the mechanisms, the prior authorization, and we appreciate that because it's complicated. And for a lot of us here, my hunger is for a holistic approach. Yes, there's a problem on the border. Yes, there's a healthcare problem. There's a problem in the mail. And how do we get our heads around something this complicated? You said something that both brings me joy, but I'd love to understand. You were saying in sort of the beginning of this year, in a couple of those months, you were seeing almost a 1/3 fall. And look, I know a couple months is really hard to get data from, but do you have a perception of what are we doing right to actually create that 1/3 fall? And how do we do more of it?
Thank you, Mr. Schweikert, and I
call me
resist the
David.
same temptation, David. I think this idea of our state legislature taking action on this, the people that you will hear after me that will provide testimony of focusing on this epidemic and understanding that these drugs for someone that is in chronic pain, these can be a miracle solution. But the way that they were being distributed, the way that they were being sold, the way that they were being prescribed provided a tremendous problem in our state. And one thing I want to give credit to is to Secretary Jay Johnson, because it was that cooperation that we saw when Arizona hosted the Super Bowl in 2015, that we could work together in partnership with the federal Department of Homeland Security. And I want to credit President Trump and Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, who is working with Colonel Frank Milstead, our border sheriffs and sheriffs across the state, along with local law enforcement. I do think this is a holistic solution that we have to come at from a standpoint of not only the rule of law, but then the best medical practices on how we handle these prescription drugs and other drugs. I know that fentanyl was mentioned. The rise and spike in heroin is a result of this opioid epidemic. So this is an all hands on deck, and it's not just for border states, because it may be border states where these drugs come through, but they're being distributed all across our nation.
And Governor, forgive me, it's the tyranny of the clock. Yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Ms. Sinema for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Governor Ducey, as you know, Medicaid ensures access to treatment and recovery services for 4 in 10 adults suffering from opiate addiction in Arizona. It's one of the reasons I voted against bills that threaten Medicaid benefits that more than 400,000 Arizonans count on via our Access program. Could you tell us about the role that Access plays in your statewide plan to ensure that Arizonans have access to the services and treatment that they need?
Thank you, Ms. Sinema. Of course, Access in Arizona is a safety net for those that need it most and the most vulnerable, but it's not just about Medicaid. As I mentioned, we added $10 million to help those that the Affordable Care Act left behind, those that were uninsured or underinsured. Also with providing dollars for those that need health care inside of our prisons. I am concerned with what's happening with the Affordable Care Act from the standpoint of providers that are in the state of Arizona. If we were to go back a decade ago, we would have had 24 providers available in our 15 counties. Today, we have 1 provider available in 14 of our 15 counties. So this is something that I will challenge Congress to act on. It's something that as a governor and as a Access Department and Department of Health Services, we will be a partner in reforming what is necessary for access to affordable and accessible health care in Arizona.
Thank you.
Okay, general yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Lesko for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Governor Ducey. I had the privilege of serving with the governor while I was in the state legislature, and I was on the health committee, so we actually got to listen to testimony on this very important issue of opiate addiction. I applaud you in the state legislature for your work on this. It is very important, very devastating problem in Arizona and throughout our country. I know that if my memory serves me correctly, in the Senate Health Committee, one of the things that we did in the legislature and you promoted was having pharmacists check a registry of sorts to make sure that the patient wasn't getting overprescribed with opiates. I think it was, if I remember, it was a balancing act of not over-regulating pharmacists and doctors and that type of thing. Can you update us on what transpired on that and what the success has been with that program?
Sure. Thank you, Ms. Lesko. Sure. And we miss you very much in the Arizona State Legislature, but Arizona's loss has been our United States Congress's gain. This focus on the use of technology has reduced doctor shopping. This is what was happening oftentimes with people that were addicted, and this is a different type of drug because it is found behind the pharmacy window. The addition of the red caps that are there so that people understand that this is a medicine to be taken seriously, to not be available to children or left in medicine cabinets. I think while it's only been a few months, the trend is incredibly positive, and it is a result of these actions. And you'll also have some experts that will follow me, Director Kara Christ, Debbie Moak, that helped put these regulations in place that would allow us to provide the best possible health care, but to protect Arizonans' health and safety. To lose 800 Arizonans in the last 16 months, and those were avoidable deaths, was far too many. And then Tim Romer will also be testifying from a law enforcement perspective. And I do think it's that partnership of healthcare and law enforcement that we can best address this epidemic to our country.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Gallego for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Governor Ducey, good to see you again. Definitely one of my proudest moments was working with Governor Brewer and other Republicans to pass Medicaid expansion, something that I think has been beneficial to this state, especially our critical care hospitals in urban areas as well as our rural areas, which also is having even a harder hit when it comes to opioid epidemics. What we've heard so far is that with this, we need a whole government approach to this. But at the same time, the actions of the Arizona government, and sometimes your proposals, are actually to diminish Medicaid expansion and also try to get people off Medicaid, when we just heard that 4 out of 10 of them actually end up using Medicaid to deal with their addiction. So what I'm trying to kind of bring together is how can we fight opioid addiction? How can Arizona take it seriously while at the same time we're taking efforts to gut Medicaid? I'll give you a good example. One of the efforts that you are pushing is to deal with the retrospective Medicaid eligibility, RME. Specifically, so if you are Medicaid eligible and you go to a hospital, that hospital will not only treat you that day, make you Medicaid eligible, you go back 3 months beyond that to actually be able to bring in funds for any type of fees that you incurred in the hospital, which is very important, as you know, for a lot of these rural hospitals. But under your proposal, you've actually asked to get rid of that. So how are you balancing this out? How make me understand, if we're really serious about dealing with opioid addiction on the enforcement side, how come we aren't really actually dealing with it on the Medicaid side and bring this all together? Well,
I don't think that these two issues are mutually exclusive, and I think when you talk about the reform of Medicaid, I've been outspoken that I don't want to see any Arizonan have the rug pulled out from underneath them. Now, I expressed the very real issue that we only have one provider in 14 of our 15 counties in the state of Arizona.
Well, that's ACA. And Medicaid has something to do. Medicaid is separate from ACA.
And when we're trying to move people off of Medicaid into work in private insurance, I think that is a preferable structure when it can be done. We've had a growing economy here in the state of Arizona, so we have tried to put policies forward that would incent people to take employment so that they could have private insurance, and we'll continue to do that.
Okay, gentleman's time's expired.
Thank you.
I thank the governor for his testimony and the members for the questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses. We'd ask that you respond to these in writing. And with that, I'll dismiss this first panel. We'll quickly take a recess. I request the clerk prepare the witness table for the second panel. That, Subcommittee will come to order. For our second panel, we are pleased to be joined by 4 distinguished witnesses to discuss this important topic. Guadalupe Ramirez is the Acting Director of Field Operations, Customs and Border Protection, Tucson Field Office. Previously, he served as the Assistant Director of Field Operations, Trade, and oversaw cargo and agricultural operations within the Tucson Field Office. The Tucson Field Office annually collects $30 million in revenues, processes 380,000 commercial trucks that transport $20 billion in trade. Scott Brown is the Special Agent in charge of Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI, in Arizona. Mr. Brown has oversight of the full spectrum of Immigration and Custom Enforcement, or ICE's, investigative activities in the state of Arizona, leads more than 500 personnel assigned to offices in Phoenix, Tucson, Douglas, Nogales, Sells, Yuma, Casa Grande, and Flagstaff. Doug Coleman is the Special Agent in charge of the DEA's Phoenix Field Division. In this position, Special Agent Coleman is responsible for the leadership and management of all DEA operations in the state of Arizona. 27-year veteran of the DEA, Special Agent Coleman began his law enforcement career in 1988. And Mr. Tim Romer, did I pronounce that correctly? Tim Romer currently serves as the state of Arizona's Deputy Director of Homeland Security and as Governor Ducey's Public Safety Policy Advisor. Prior to joining Arizona Department of Homeland Security, Mr. Romer served in the Central Intelligence Agency for over 10 years. I now recognize Director Ramirez to testify.
Thank you. Chairwoman McSally, Ranking Member Grijalva, and distinguished members.
Microphone a little closer to your mouth so everybody can hear. Thank you.
How about there?
Thank you.
Chairwoman McSally, Ranking Member Grijalva, distinguished members, thank you for the opportunity to appear today and discuss the role of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, in combating the flow of illicit opioids, including synthetic opioids such as fentanyl, into the United States. My name is Guadalupe Ramirez. I am the Acting Director of Field Operations for CBP's Office of Field Operations in Tucson. Since I began my career in government in 1985, I have worked to facilitate legitimate trade and travel and protect our borders. In my more than 30 years of federal service, I've seen a great deal of change. I began serving in the Tucson Field Office in 2009. Since then, I've seen a marked increase in the volume and potency of drugs interdicted at the port of entry by CBP. I've seen interdictions of heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl increase dramatically. 357% more heroin was seized in the Tucson Field Office ports in 2017 than in FY 2009. The number of heroin seizures has increased 5-fold since 2009. In FY 2009, there were 23 heroin seizures at the Arizona ports, averaging 8.3 pounds each. In FY 2017, there were 114 heroin seizures, averaging 10.1 pounds each. Today, heroin seizures are currently 28% ahead of last year's pace. Seizures of fentanyl in 1 year increased 458% from 2016 to 2017. In the land border environment, my area of experience, smugglers use a wide variety of tactics and techniques to conceal drugs. CBP officers regularly find drugs taped to individuals' bodies, hidden inside vehicle seats, gas tanks, tires, dashboards, as well as commingled in commercial shipments and concealed in commercial conveyances. Seizures like these often involve the use of technology, canines, or both. CBP officers utilize non-intrusive inspection equipment, NII, including Z-Portal, high-energy mobile, and gamma-ray imaging systems to detect the illegal transit of synthetic drugs hidden in passenger vehicles, cargo containers, and other conveyances entering the United States. Canine operations are also an invaluable component of CBP's counter-narcotics operations. For example, on May 1st, 2018, a CBP narcotics detection canine at Nogales, Arizona port of entry alerted officers to almost 11 pounds of heroin wrapped around the midsection of an individual entering the United States. The heroin had an estimated street value in excess of $188,000. Officers seized the drugs and turned the arrested subject over to Homeland Security investigations. We are also actively engaging with our federal, state, local, tribal, and international partners to streamline our counter-narcotics efforts. Tucson Field Office is actively engaged with the Joint Port Enforcement Group alongside Homeland Security investigations to ensure higher rates of contraband prosecution by assigning CBP officers to HSI to assist with casework. By working together to respond to, investigate, and prosecute illicit contraband seizures at the Arizona ports of entry, prosecution rates have increased to 97%. We're also working with the government of Mexico in implementing unified cargo processing at the commercial facilities in Nogales, Douglas, and San Luis. This brought customs inspectors from Mexico into U.S. commercial facilities for joint processing and joint inspection of cargo coming from Mexico. Currently, 16% of all commercial cargo processed at the Arizona ports of entry is tied to this program, with expectations for increase. This has significantly changed cargo processing and is considered a best practice along the southwest border ports. In coordination with our partnership and with the support of Congress, we will continue to refine, enhance the effectiveness of our detection and interdiction capabilities to prevent the entry of opioids and other illicit drugs into the United States. Chairwoman McSally, Ranking Member Grijalva, and distinguished members, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ramirez. The chair now recognizes Mr. Brown to testify for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairwoman McSally, attendees from the Arizona Congressional Delegation. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the opioid crisis in the United States, particularly along the border here in Arizona, and the efforts of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement to target, investigate, disrupt, dismantle, and bring to justice the criminal elements responsible for the manufacturing, smuggling, and distribution of dangerous opioids. As the largest investigative agency within the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, ICE Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, investigates and enforces more than 400 federal criminal statutes. HSI special agents use their broad authority to investigate all types of cross-border criminal activity and work in close collaboration with U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the Drug Enforcement Administration in a unified effort with both domestic and international law enforcement partners to target transnational criminal organizations, or TCOs, that are supplying dangerous opioids to the United States. Today, I would like to highlight our efforts to reduce the supply of illicit opioids, such as heroin and fentanyl, from coming into the U.S. along the southwest border in Arizona and the operational challenges we encounter. The U.S. is in the midst of an opioid epidemic that is being fueled by the smuggling and trafficking of heroin and illicit fentanyl. Based on our investigative efforts, U.S. law enforcement has identified China and Mexico as primary sources of the U.S. illicit opioid threat. Illicit fentanyl, fentanyl analogs, and their immediate precursors are most often produced in China. From China, these substances are shipped primarily through mail carriers directly to the U.S. or alternatively shipped directly to the TCOs in Mexico. Once in the Western Hemisphere, often in Mexico, fentanyl or its analogs are prepared and mixed with other narcotics and fillers and or pressed into pill form, then moved to the illicit U.S. market where demand for prescription opioids and heroin remain at epidemic levels. Mexican cartels have seized upon the profit potential of opioids, including synthetic opioids, and seem to have invested in growing their share of this illicit market. We're even seeing an increased number of instances in which precursors originating in China and smuggled into the U.S. have traveled through the U.S. destined for the southwest border locations, to include here in Arizona. The Mexican cartels have then attempted to smuggle the precursors out of the U.S., allowing them to synthesize them into fentanyl in Mexico with the intent to smuggle the finished product back into the U.S. for distribution and consumption. The final product is sold as heroin or as a prescription opioid, and the end user may not be aware of the presence of fentanyl. The vast majority of fentanyl and heroin entering or transiting Arizona is smuggled across the shared border with Mexico via the land border ports of entry. Like other narcotics supplied by Mexico, heroin and fentanyl loads are often smuggled utilizing deep concealment within passenger vehicles, as the TCOs exploit the high volume of legitimate cross-border traffic at our ports of entry as part of the concealment of their smuggling efforts. Heroin and fentanyl loads are also smuggled by pedestrians entering the U.S. at ports of entry, often concealed on their person or in their bags or backpacks. Almost all the Mexico-sourced drug supply entering the U.S. via the border in Arizona can be attributed to the Sinaloa cartel. HSI continues to investigate and identify the leadership of the Sinaloa cartel and attack the critical organizational nodes of smuggling facilitators and financial networks that sustain their operations. It is imperative that we continue to focus our efforts on disrupting and dismantling the Sinaloa cartel, which not only smuggles opioids, but other narcotics like methamphetamine and cocaine that also have a devastating impact on our communities. HSI has made significant strides in fiscal year 2017 in combating the fentanyl epidemic in the U.S., as evidenced by a 400% increase in fentanyl-related seizures. However, even with these advances, there is no single solution or government entity that can stop the flow of dangerous and illicit opioids like fentanyl into the U.S. or keep them from harming the American public. Tackling this complex threat involves a united, comprehensive, and aggressive approach across law enforcement in collaboration with experts in the medical, science, and public health communities. HSI will continue to work with our federal, state, local, and tribal partners to improve the efficiency of information sharing and operational coordination to address the challenges and threats posed by illicit narcotics smuggling into the U.S. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm pleased to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. The chair now recognizes Mr. Coleman to testify for 5 minutes.
Distinguished members of the committee, on behalf of Acting Administrator Patterson and the men and women of the Drug Enforcement Administration, I appreciate your invitation to testify today about the growing threat of opioid trafficking across the southwest border and the impact that these activities of narco-trafficking organizations are having on Arizona. For DEA, the opioid crisis is and will unfortunately continue to be the top drug threat facing our nation. This epidemic includes not only prescription opioid medications, but also the proliferation of heroin, illicit fentanyl, and fentanyl analogs. Despite record numbers of overdose deaths, nearly 64,000 in 2016 alone, we are making progress on the prescription drug front. However, we are witnessing a fundamental shift towards cheaper, easier to obtain heroin and illicit fentanyl and its related analogs. Over the last few years, Mexican drug cartels have exploited the increased demand for heroin and boosted their heroin production, transportation, and trafficking operations to get more heroin into the United States, predominantly across the southwest border. In addition, Chinese manufacturers began to produce fentanyl and fentanyl analogs and ship them to the United States via mail or to Mexico to be mixed into the U.S. domestic heroin supply, or pressed into a pill form and then moved to the illicit U.S. market, where demand for prescription opioids and heroin remain at epidemic proportions. More recently, Mexican DTOs are acquiring precursor chemicals and manufacturing fentanyl and its analogs to compete with Chinese suppliers. The DEA in Arizona has been at the forefront of recognizing and responding to this increased heroin and fentanyl trafficking from the Mexican cartels. The Sinaloa cartel is the primary drug threat to Arizona, as this organization influences and controls virtually all transportation and entry point importation along the Arizona-Mexico border. Additionally, the Sinaloa cartel directs command and control cells in Phoenix and Tucson, who are the choke points for both the drugs coming into the United States and the illicit proceeds returning to Mexico. DEA's Phoenix Field Division's response has been multi-layered and comprehensive. No group in American law enforcement knows the Sinaloa cartel and their operations better than the DEA in Arizona, and our strategy was developed based on this long-term knowledge of how this organization operates. The first pillar of the strategy involves increasing our focus on command and control cells operating in Phoenix and Tucson. These cells are often difficult to penetrate and require lengthy, complex investigations targeting communication facilities and cartel members who direct operations throughout the United States and coordinate with high-level cartel leadership in Mexico. Working with our state, local, tribal, and federal partners, we've increased these type of complex conspiracy investigations targeting opiate trafficking by more than 60% over the last 3 years, resulting in the arrest of hundreds of high-level traffickers and the seizure of thousands of pounds of heroin and fentanyl, as well as the disruption and dismantlement of many of these cells. The next pillar of our strategy was to increase our ability to directly support state and local law enforcement efforts targeting overdose deaths and community impact. To do this, we created a Heroin Enforcement Action Team, or HEAT, to directly respond to local area opioid-related overdoses, attempting to expand overdose investigations to identify and target those directly responsible for supplying heroin fentanyl to the overdose victims. By doing this, HEAT is a force multiplier to any state and local heroin investigation and allows us to target and bring to justice those individuals having the greatest negative impact in the local community. Since its inception, the HEAT team has expanded to include relationships with over 40 governmental and law enforcement agencies in Arizona and has arrested and prosecuted many individuals who were directly responsible for distributing opioids resulting in overdoses. The HEAT has been an extremely beneficial program to local law enforcement, and we continue to expand both its footprint and operations throughout the state. The final pillar of our strategy involves a robust and comprehensive public awareness and education campaign. In 2015 and 2017, we partnered with Arizona State University on 2 hooked television specials about the dangers of heroin and diverted controlled prescription drugs that reached over 2 million Arizonans. We also conducted over 135 community outreach events over the past 3 years, educating thousands of Arizona residents about the dangers of heroin and opioid abuse. Finally, DEA officials have appeared on Arizona media, TV, radio, and newspaper sites over 100 times in the past 3 years discussing the opioid addiction issue in a variety of forums. While DEA in Arizona has a robust and comprehensive strategy to combat opioid abuse and trafficking in our state, we realize that our efforts, while having a significant impact and many successes, must be maintained and expanded to continue to best serve the citizens of Arizona and the United States. Rest assured that the men and women of DEA in Arizona will never relent, and we will continue to do everything in our power to do our part to help end this deadly epidemic. On behalf of DEA, I thank the committee for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Romer for 5 minutes to testify.
Good morning, Chairwoman McSally, Ranking Member Grijalva, Congressman Gallego, Congresswoman Lesko, and Congressman Schweikert. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on Arizona's efforts to combat the opioid epidemic and to combat illegal activity happening on our southern border. Illegal activity perpetrated across the southern border of the United States infiltrates communities across federal, state, local, and tribal jurisdictions, making it absolutely necessary for law enforcement agencies at every level to work together in order to stop these threats. Arizona's border county sheriffs, police chiefs, and their teams are on the front lines protecting their communities every day. No one knows the effects of transnational crime on our citizens better than they do. They see the devastation of human trafficking on victims and their families. They see the destructive power that illegal drugs, overdoses, illegal weapons, and ammunition have on human lives, and they are dedicated to stopping it. Formed in 2015, Arizona's Border Strike Force, led by the Arizona Department of Public Safety, is truly unique in the United States in that it harnesses the expertise and dedication of our local law enforcement and combines it with the power of the federal government to keep America safe. This team's intra-agency collaboration is unparalleled, and they have results to prove it. No day or night is routine for this team, and I want to share a little more of what they've been interdicting on our behalf. A vehicle is stopped going north on I-17 and 5 pounds, or almost 225,000 hits of heroin, are found concealed in the spare tire. And yet another vehicle is stopped going westbound on I-10. Indicators of criminal activity prove true when 6 pounds of fentanyl are found wrapped in a gift bag. To give you some perspective, a 2 to 3 milligram dose of fentanyl is known to be lethal. So in that one car driving down on I-10 was enough to kill anywhere from 900,000 to over 1.3 million people. And those aren't even the large-scale operations like Operation Cascabel 1 and 2 that resulted in the seizure of 131 pounds of meth, 12 pounds of cocaine, 618 pounds of marijuana, and 32 stolen vehicles, along with the arrest of 39 felons. I want to emphasize that we can quantify results in a number of ways, but there's one metric we can't account for, That's the number of lives that have been saved. Every human trafficker caught is one less wreaking havoc in the lives of their victims. Every dose of narcotics seized is one less destroying lives within our communities in Arizona. We are saving lives because the Border Strike Force and our federal partners across 2 presidential administrations are taking the fight to heavily armed drug cartels and those who would do us harm. Arizona is also doing more in real time to prevent deaths from the scourge of opioid overdoses. Since Arizona's opioid emergency was declared in June 2017, we have provided over 6,000 kits or more than 12,000 doses of the overdose reversal drug naloxone. This has been distributed to 63 law enforcement agencies across our state. Nearly 1,000 law enforcement officers have been trained to recognize and treat an opioid overdose. These officers have administered naloxone to 364 individuals, all but 9 of whom survived the immediate out-of-hospital event. Also, since June, approximately 84% of the suspected non-fatal overdoses received naloxone pre-hospital from EMS, law enforcement, or community members. In closing, I want to say thank you once again to our federal partners and everyone across the state, local, and federal levels who support our efforts. I am confident that as our partnerships continue to grow in the form of information sharing, manpower, and monetary support, more lives will be saved, and we are grateful for that. Thank you again for affording me the opportunity to testify this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Romer. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Director Ramirez, the Interdict Act came out of our committee and was signed into law in January, which provided CBP $9 million to procure new opioid and other illicit substance screening devices, lab equipment, facilities, personnel, for all operational hours to expedite the testing of suspected opioid seized at the border and port of entry. Have you seen any of that flow into Arizona yet and making an impact at our ports of entry here?
Yes, ma'am, Chairman, Chairwoman McSally.
Yeah, could you just speak up?
For some reason, this mic really wants to be very close to me. We have in a couple of areas. One of the biggest concerns we have, as you know, with fentanyl, as deadly as it is to ensure that as we dismantle vehicles and we get the narcotics out and we test them, that we do not contaminate any of our officers or the traveling public. The technology that we're using now, thanks to the support of Congress, is our testing equipment, which is basically laser-based. Instead of having to take the narcotics and put it into a little pouch and break the amulets, you have the TruNarc and the Gemini systems, which will read it. And we also have the glove boxes, which is a sealed compartment where you put the narcotics in, and then you put your hand in through gloves. It's completely sealed, and you test the narcotics. That, along with X-ray equipment, which is always welcome at the ports of entry, has been a great help.
Great, thank you. Look, this whole panel is about the supply and the easy supply that's out there for people to become addicted. Our next panel will be talking more about a whole of society approach to address some of the other root issues. But as we're looking to crack down on the supply, is it fair to characterize that as efforts have been made to crack down on the overprescription and the pill mills and those types of things, you have people who are addicted that are now going onto the illicit market because it's cheaper for them to get the product they need to feed their addiction, and that's where the dangers are increased because it can be, laced with higher doses than expected or other drugs, and people are overdosing and dying because they're being driven to the illicit market. Is that a fair characterization of what's happened as our level of awareness has gone up and how the dangers are increasing? If anybody wants to.
I believe so, if I may, Chairwoman. 4 out of every 5 new heroin users start addicted to a painkiller, a prescription painkiller. And so as we've seen as the governor's testimony and all the great efforts of the state of Arizona, Dr. Kara Chris leading the Department of Health Services, as we've seen those statistics plummet of the number of opioids prescribed, that's going to make a huge dent in those new heroin users.
Yeah. Anybody else want to comment on that?
I think that you hit it right on the head. The reality is that as we've seen our prescription drug epidemic increase, the Mexican cartels, as they always do, have taken advantage of the fact that we have so many. And then what's happened is the increased heroin has created more competition for them, which has led to the increased production and distribution of fentanyl to make a stronger product to compete against each other to make sure that they can keep those repeat customers.
Okay, thanks. So we hear the number often that 90% of drugs that come over the border come through the ports of entry. When we're talking specifically versus in between the ports of entry, when we're talking specifically about opioids, heroin, fentanyl, like everything that's related to this crisis, do we have I don't know who can answer this, percentage or understanding of what's coming through the ports of entry and what's coming through the mail from China?
Difficult question to answer. The answer is if I knew where all of it was coming from, I'd seize
From
all
what
of
we
it.
know, of course, from what we know.
From what we know, the reality is that most of our large shipments of hard drugs are coming across the border. We do see a significant portion coming through the mail of the smaller quantities, especially when it comes to fentanyl. So I don't know if there's a percentage that we can put on it. 90% probably seems a little bit high, but there's a very significant portion
But
that
of
comes
that coming
across
across the border, what number is coming through the ports of entry versus?
That's for the hard drugs, it's probably 90% at least. Yeah,
Okay,
the marijuana, the
great.
softer drugs come through they walk
So
across
the reality is, obviously, because it's still so cheap on the streets, that a lot is getting through that we're not detecting. What else can we do in order to be able to detect it? We've got some additional non-intrusive inspection capabilities. Is there anything else, Mr. Ramirez, that we can do? Because we're missing a lot of it. Nothing against, not related to the professionalism of your teams here. It's just very difficult to detect and intercept. So what else can be done?
I think the continued support that we're seeing from Congress when it comes to staffing, thank you for your support with the VRA. Staffing is a huge part of it, infrastructure and technology. So the continued support in those areas will actually help us dramatically in our efforts at the ports of entry.
Okay, great. I'm going to yield back my 2 seconds. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, acting ranking member, Mr. Grijalva, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Ramirez, following up on the chair's question, and if I may, Madam Chair, if there's no objection, enter in a record a statement by Mr. Anthony Reardon, National President, National Treasury Employees Union, on the topic of this hearing, and
Without objection.
thank you very much. To address the CBP and OFO staffing shortages, and to address the expected ever-increasing volume of activity at the ports of entry, that involves also the economics of it, as you've explained to me, in terms of trade, import-export, that come through the ports of entry, not just now, but in the future. Ranking Member Vela from this committee introduced H.R. 4940, a bipartisan bill, the Border and Port Security Act, that would authorize the hiring of 500 additional CBP customs officers, 100 CBP agricultural specialists, and an additional OFO trade operations staff annually until you begin to close the staffing gaps and at the ports of entry. Your reaction to that piece of legislation, do you see that as part of both the deterrence that we're talking about today and the seizures that we're talking about today?
Absolutely. That is welcome news, Congressman Grijalva. When we talk about our complex jobs at the port of entry, as you know, it is not just, it's that balance between facilitating legitimate trade and travel and interdicting bad people and bad things. So our job is to encourage travel and trade, not discourage it. Obviously, staffing is a big part of it. We have implemented a huge recruitment effort in our agency where basically every recruiter nationwide at this point is recruiting for Arizona. Having those extra bodies allow us not just to open additional lanes, but to provide better service to the traveling public and the trade community, and again, operate more of our canines, our x-rays, and have a stronger enforcement posture at our ports of entry. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Coleman, if I may, the process of coordination of all these activities, interagency coordination, across jurisdictions coordination, and with stakeholders of various types, community and others. I know it's rare, but there are some turf issues sometimes. And certainly doesn't happen with members of Congress, but I'm sure it's the same experience that you have.
Welcome to my district.
Tell me a little bit about DEA being the principal agency, but also Homeland Security now having a broad authority over the same subject. Tell me about that interagency issue.
I think that having been a 30-year law enforcement officer, I can tell you that, and I've worked all over the country and the world, I think that the relationships between Arizona law enforcement agencies at the federal, state, and local level is unprecedented in my career. While we occasionally get into to spats over issues, there's nothing that we haven't, in the time I've been here, which is 11 years now, that we haven't been able to solve. Scott's people are integrated in my offices, and my people are integrated in his offices. We work very closely together. We're partners on many task force groups. I have over 80 state and local officers assigned to my task forces. He probably has a similar number.
Okay.
So our integration is complete in as much as we can be in this state.
Thank you. And my last point, Mr. Romer, you mentioned all those other things. You mentioned quickly about weapons. 70%, based on statistics from 2009 to 2014, of weapons seized across the border, in Mexico primarily, came from the United States. That's the origin. It's illegal for weapon of possession in Mexico. It's legal to have them, and they're primarily in the hands of cartels, and they've savaged that country as well. So what do you see in terms of what we're able to do in terms of what's going from here to there?
Sure, Ranking Member Grijalva. Just the Border Strike Force, it's a huge concern for us from a public safety perspective. Just the Border Strike Force
And
alone.
statistically, you mentioned tonnage and all that. Have we arrested people? Have we seen?
Absolutely. And so 280 firearms have been seized just by the Border Strike Force during Border Strike Force operations. But staying up to date on a daily basis on what Mr. Ramirez and all of CBP is doing and the success they're having, they are interdicting more weapons going southbound across the border. I don't have the exact statistics for you, but I will tell you that I've been very pleasantly surprised at the number of success stories coming out of CBP on those weapons going southbound.
Yield back, Madam Chair.
I recognize Mr. Schweiker for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Raul actually makes an interesting point. The leaking border basically devastates people on both sides. And there becomes the discussion of what do we do to lock it down. Can I do, and forgive me for, and this may be for more Mr. Brown or Mr. Coleman, a quick thought experiment. Many of us have been working on pieces of legislation. We're blessed they look like they're going to move, that prior authorization for opioids, some changes within the way opioids are prescribed, the ability for both physicians, pharmacies, the data to see it. What happens if we're successful, that the prescription level of opioids crashes? Do the bad actors come and say, well, you're cutting our future profits because the migration we were hearing before of medical opioids, that ends up potentially future becoming a customer for heroin, eventually a customer for maybe fentanyl. Do the bad actors try to find another way to continue the level of usage and devastation in our society?
I think over the short term that will happen. I think that there's no question that we have to lower the amount of these prescriptions that we're writing to get a hold of the actual number of addicted that we have here. I do think that the cartels will make moves to try to keep that addicted population addicted so they can continue.
Do they go out and try to find new customers?
Yes, what they do is they go out and they recruit customers, and they also introduce new products into the system, fentanyls, their analogs, things like that, to get people more and more hooked.
Okay, that's partially where I wanted to go. Mr. Brown?
I would echo what Doug said, and I would add, I think one of the things we're seeing commonly is they're pressing fentanyl into a pill form.
As you know, was it yesterday, there was a large bust of what we thought was a prescription. It turns out it was a derivative of a fentanyl product.
So I think that's a way of kind of marketing it to those people that had started out with a legitimate opioid addiction. I think the reality is there are going to be some people that when they recognize that, hey, I'm going to a wholly illegal source to get my drugs, that will scare a couple of people away and scare them into the treatment that they need. And to save those couple of lives, I would agree with Doug that we need to work to.
It's an interesting thought experiment that will our success on one side, because there we can treat it as a medical crisis, ends up moving a population into almost a criminal, much more difficult to identify our populations to help. Mr. Ramirez, help me understand. I sat through a security briefing almost a year ago, and it was a very small one, a little geeky. We actually did the chemical compounds that are in fentanyl, and I think they were using some other derivatives of fentanyl, and just the stunning, addictive, poisonous, but how small it was. How do you capture, how do you find when something the size of your pinky is the death of all of us in this room?
It is a very scary proposition, Congressman, and at the ports of entry, what we're encountering is large quantities. It's amazing when I look. As I said, 30 years in, I remember when I started with Customs in El Paso. If you caught 1 kilo of heroin back then, you were the man for a year. Today, when we see 60, 70 pounds, and what they're coming in is the packages are coming with multiple pills in the package.
And my concern, though, is, and this may be more of a question for a chemist, heroin, fentanyl, for the same market value, or for the same addictive quality, what's my volume differences?
And we don't know that until we have sent it to the labs, including the DEA labs, to have them tested. I believe that'd be a question more suited for Mr. Coleman.
Mr. Coleman?
So fentanyl is obviously very, very much more stronger than heroin, and what we see is the profit margin on a kilogram of fentanyl. $30,000 for a kilo, 1.5 million is the profit you can make off of that.
And so you're starting to see a movement away from heroin products, to.
Now, unfortunately, we're seeing both coming in. We've seen massive increases in the fentanyl and massive increases in the heroin to feed that addicted population.
And my understanding is there's some even new chemical derivatives of fentanyl that are even more dangerous than.
Yeah, when you talk about fentanyl, it's a synthetic opioid, and so it can be, with just very small chemical changes, you can create different drugs. Carfentanil, U-47-700, some of those drugs are hundreds of times more powerful than fentanyl.
The carfentanil was fascinating chemically. Madam Chairman, forgive me, I know I'm over time, but for all of us on the panel, it's worth a bit of a thought experiment of, and I don't want to speak out of what was given to us in the SCIF, but if that type of product ended up in something we're all publicly consuming, could you imagine the brutality that comes with that?
Yeah, thanks. Gentlemen, time's expired. Looks like Ms. Sinema had to go, so the chair now recognizes Mr. Gallego for 5 minutes.
No worries. Thank you, gentlemen. Director Ramirez, I'm very lucky to serve on the Armed Services Committee, and in that we have to make decisions between, whether we're going to buy tanks, whether we're going to buy aircraft carriers, a whole lot of things. It ranges from, bullets to bombs. And I have to make decisions every year through the National Defense Authorization Act. When it comes to fighting the opioid epidemic, we don't have unlimited amount of resources either for this, right? Haven't heard, we're in debt. We're growing even more into debt because of this latest tax plan, and we'll probably do that for the next 10 years. If I had the opportunity to give you $25 billion, and you had to choose between a wall or $25 billion to put more men at Customs and the border, and thank you very much, men and women, professionals at our custom and ports of entries, where would you choose your resources to be in terms of trying to fight the opioid epidemic?
That's a little unfair.
I know, that's why I asked it.
Because,
if it was fair, I wouldn't ask it.
Right, because you're not going to find a port director that's going to say that he cannot do without more men or women.
Okay, I'll stop. I don't want to get you in trouble. I'm going to stop there. I appreciate the honesty. One of the other areas, and Congressman McSally's talked about this, Congressman Sinema has talked in great length about this also, is because of the understaffing at the ports of entry, we're actually essentially using temporary personnel right now to fill those gaps. What is that, in terms of operational outcomes, what is that causing in terms of the consequences of that on an everyday basis, or just in terms of long-term sustainability?
Well, long-term, with our new recruiting efforts and the fact that we finally have people in the pipeline, both pre-academy, academy, and post-academy, it looks like there is light at the end of the tunnel. Long-term, it actually benefits the agency when you bring people from other ports of entry. As you know, the southwest border is very unique when it comes to our jobs, very exciting, action-filled, very different from someone who sits in an airport or a northern border port. So when they have an opportunity to come and work side by side with the men and women assigned to the ports of Arizona, it is a learning experience which they take back to their ports of entry, and in turn strengthens the operations of those ports of entry. So I hear it from port directors who are not happy about having to give up resources for a short time, but when those resources get back, they're very pleased with what they find.
So, and then just to go dive a little deeper, in terms of what we're looking at in terms of shortages right now for permanent staff, what would you say, or how many would you say do we need to fill the gap, especially in the Tucson sector?
In the Tucson field office, I believe we're still a few hundred positions short. We had, like I said, we've had success in hiring, but with attrition, it's take a step forward, a couple steps forward, one step back, kind of a thing. So we're still a few hundred overall short.
And is the attrition because of baby boomers aging out, or people just deciding that the strain of the job is just too much for their family, or just for personal income reasons?
No, it's really more blood is thicker than water. A lot of folks, when we hire them from the other parts of the United States, in time they want to get back to family. We have had some of our officers who transferred to get closer to family, who have since come back to help us out as just temporary assignments, and they will tell you that they miss the camaraderie, they miss the esprit de corps at the Arizona ports of entry, and they actually miss living in Arizona. So most of it is people just rotating out, trying to get closer to home and family.
And so, unfortunately, cartels, they're very well funded themselves. They're innovative. They have a product they need to sell, and they have a market that wants it. What are we doing in terms of technology to keep up with all the ways that they're trying to get their illicit drugs into this country? And is there more we can do along those lines to basically, ratchet up our, I guess I would say, our levels to make sure we're matching their levels?
One of the best X-ray systems that we have right now, newly implemented, is the Z-Portal technology, which is actually a low-energy system, which travelers do not have to get out of their vehicle; they can just drive right through. That is one of the best tools. We just finished installing the latest one in San Luis. We have in Douglas. We have.
How many more of those do we need?
I'd like to see one at every port of entry, so I think and we're almost there, especially our larger ports of entry. So we already have them in Douglas, Nogales, San Luis, and in Lukeville, so we're about there.
Excellent.
But those have been a great addition to our enforcement posture.
Thank you. You'll be back.
All right, gentleman goes back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Lesko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to say to the panel, thank you for your service to our country, and thank you to all the law enforcement that works to protect our communities and our country. I really appreciate it. I think you testified, and this is to any of you, that most of the illicit opioids come through the ports of entry. And from the data that I see here, it mostly is coming through the San Diego sector, it looks like. Correct me if I'm wrong. My question is, how do you, if people are being inspected, if they know they're going through a port of entry, and they know they're going to be inspected, why would they come through the ports of entry, and how do you know that there's not a bunch of other drug traffickers coming through other parts of the border?
So from a DEA perspective, I can tell you that the reality is that they certainly know that some of them are going to get taken off as they come across, but they will send multiple people through at a time. When CBP or BP catches them, moves them away, then 4 others can sneak in behind them. So they use a variety of techniques, but they build into their business model the fact that they're going to lose a significant portion of the dope that comes across. And so they flood us, essentially, with more people coming across than we can catch.
So, and thank you for that answer, but my question is, let's say you testified, or not you specifically, that they strap it on their body and that type of thing, but how do you know that a bunch of people aren't coming through other areas of the border, not ports of entry, that have strapped on illicit drugs because they're not going through a port of entry where there's going to be any type of inspection?
Again, we know from seizures made by Border Patrol that they really aren't encountering hard narcotics between the ports of entry. The reality is, if you're crossed at a non-port of entry, if you are detected, you're going to be stopped, you're going to be apprehended, you're going to be searched. If you're coming through a port of entry, you're blending in with a huge volume of traffic, of which we can only inspect a small portion of those vehicles and pedestrians. So it's playing the odds. Again, through that, you're automatically doing something wrong and are going to be more heavily scrutinized if you're caught crossing between a port of entry.
Thank you. And Madam Chair and anyone from the panel, I know that you may not know the exact answer to this, but for every amount of illicit drugs that you detect, how much do you think is undetected?
Question.
Hard to know, I know, but you probably have a guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's a significant portion that gets through. Obviously, at DEA, we work around the entire world, so we see the expansion of these drugs coming and landing in other states, stuff that we know came through the port of entry. Our cases lead us from other parts of the country, lead us back to Arizona, and so we know that there's a lot that gets through. So I'd shudder to hazard a guess, but there is a significant amount that gets through all of us.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. I do want to note that the appropriations bill included $284 million for port and drug inspection technologies within CBP and $71 million specifically for opioid detention. So hopefully we're seeing more flow to the different ports of entry, more technology flow to the ports of entry for that non-intrusive inspection. We have a lot more to talk about, but we don't have a lot of time. So I just want to say thanks to our witnesses for all that you do in order to keep our community safe, and everything that all of your members do every single day to keep us safe and to address this issue. There's a lot more that we can do together to solve, so this is just really a platform for us, and we look forward to continuing to work with you moving forward to address this crisis. I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses. We'll ask you to respond those in writing. And with that, I'll dismiss this panel and request that the clerk prepare the witness table for our third panel. are these guys are both coming back, right? Yeah, there's Schweikert.
Yeah, let's go.
There's Lesko. Okay. So just wait for Grijalva.
I think this is Mr.
We could
Warner
start
here.
without
Yes.
Gallego, right? Subcommittee will come to order. And while our last panel very much focused on the supply of these addictive opioid and other substances, this panel is going to be talking more about solutions and within society and civic society and all elements, what can we be doing to have early identification and prevention and treatment to provide wholeness for people that have struggled with addiction. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion on this panel. So I'm pleased to welcome 5 distinguished witnesses for our third and final panel today. First is Dr. Kara Christ, serves as Director of Arizona Department of Health Services. She's worked for the agency for more than 9 years in multiple positions. In May 2015, Dr. Christ was appointed as Director by Governor Doug Ducey. Second is Dr. Glorinda Segay, became the Health Director of Navajo Nation in July 2017. In this position, she is responsible for overseeing the direction of 14 different programs, which include direct patient care as well as the provision of Medicaid and Medicare for the Navajo people. Previously, she provided psychotherapy and group therapy treatments as well as working on suicide prevention. Mrs. Debbie Moak became the Director of the Governor's Office of Youth, Faith, and Family in 2015. She served as Director under Arizona Governor Ducey until June of 2017. Previously, she worked as an elementary school teacher for 10 years. In 1999, she co-founded Not My Kid, an anti-substance abuse nonprofit with her husband. The nonprofit aims to help young people make positive choices. Mr. Jay Corey has served as the President and CEO of the Phoenix Rescue Mission since September 2011. Mr. Corey has over 25 years of senior leadership experience in religious-based rescue and recovery ministries, with a proven track record of success in building ministries and recovery programs. And Mr. Wayne Warner is a graduate of Teen Challenge, a faith-based program with practical solutions to men and women with life-controlling issues. Very familiar with Teen Challenge. I was a former board member at Teen Challenge. Initially a skeptic, Wayne graduated in 2014 and is now a firm advocate for the program, which helps people, quote, become mentally sound, emotionally balanced, socially adjusted, physically well, spiritually alive, and employment ready, end quote. The chair now recognizes Dr. Christ to testify.
Chairwoman McSally and other members in attendance, thank you for this opportunity to share our progress towards Arizona's public health emergency, the opioid epidemic. The opioid crisis is different than other drug epidemics. While heroin and other illicit opioids present a problem in our communities, the start for many who develop opioid use disorder begins at a doctor's office in an attempt to relieve pain. It wasn't until recently that medical professionals realized how dangerous these medications are. Merely taking them as directed for 6 days or more significantly increases your chance of dependence. And 4 out of 5 new heroin users started as opioid medication users. We knew to address this issue, our response required a coordinated, multifaceted approach from all sectors, including public health and medical professionals, law enforcement, patients, and many others in our communities. Last year, my agency, the Arizona Department of Health Services, issued our report on opioid deaths, showing more than 2 Arizonans died each day in 2016 from these dangerous drugs. Upon release of that report, Governor Ducey took decisive action and declared a public health emergency, mobilizing resources and allowing us to collect real-time data. Within hours of the declaration, our Health Emergency Operations Center began analyzing data, gathering partners, and identifying solutions. The numbers reported are staggering. Since June of 2017, over 1,200 suspected opioid deaths, 8,000 overdoses, and 760 babies with neonatal abstinence syndrome have been reported to the department. After over 50 stakeholder meetings involving over 1,350 partners, the department issued our opioid action plan. During the past year, Arizona has been implementing our plan and completing the activities Governor Ducey directed in the emergency declaration, and we've made great progress. The reporting and information sharing requirements first established through the enhanced surveillance activity are now codified in rule. Almost 1,000 law enforcement officers statewide have been trained to provide naloxone, and to date, we've provided over 6,100 naloxone kits to over 63 law enforcement agencies throughout Arizona, allowing our officers to save lives by reversing overdoses in the field. Our healthcare facilities now have rules for opioid prescribing and treatment, ensuring they have policies and procedures aimed at preventing opioid use disorder. We're also in the process of developing rules to regulate pain management clinics and end pill mills. Our Arizona opioid prescribing guidelines have been updated to incorporate the newest information from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, encourage a shift in pain care to avoid unnecessary exposure to opioids, and emphasize the use of non-stigmatizing language. We've created a free 24/7 statewide consultation opioid assistance and referral line. This is for prescribers seeking advice about prescribing opioids and caring for patients with opioid use disorder. 100% of Arizona's health professional schools participated in the development of the nation's first statewide curriculum across all prescriber training programs for pain and addiction using a whole person approach. Integration of this curriculum is set to begin during the 2018 to 19 school year. We've also partnered with the Arizona Department of Corrections to pilot a program that provides free naloxone for individuals at high risk of overdose who are released from our correctional facilities. Multiple state agencies, including Access, the state's Medicaid program, the Governor's Office of Youth, Faith and Family, and the Arizona Board of Pharmacy have come together to increase access to peer support, enhance youth prevention programs, and improve the Controlled Substances Prescription Monitoring Program. However, one of the biggest successes is the unanimous bipartisan passage of the comprehensive Arizona Opioid Epidemic Act that went into effect on April 26th. The act consists of a number of life-saving policy initiatives, including a $10 million investment to enhance access to treatment for uninsured or underinsured Arizonans, a Good Samaritan law to allow people to call 911 for a potential opioid overdose, requiring insurance companies to make one form of medication-assisted treatment available without a prior authorization, and limiting the first fill of an opioid prescription to 5 days for all opioid-naive patients while protecting chronic pain patients currently on these medications. While this legislation just went into effect, we are already seeing improvements based on our comprehensive efforts. In addition to the statistics that Governor Ducey presented earlier, we've also seen a 50% decline in the number of high-dose prescriptions when you look at this April since last April. Though we've completed all of the directed activities and the emergency declaration has been terminated, we know that our work is just beginning. Arizona has an ongoing commitment to continue to identify and implement new solutions to prevent future overdoses and deaths. Thank you for allowing me to talk about our progress today.
Thank you, Dr. Chris. The chair now recognizes Dr. Segay to testify for 5 minutes.
Yat Bene, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Dr. Segay, now Nation Executive Director for Department of Health. President and Vice President also send their regards. And so thank you for having me here today, and thank you for all that you do for us. So I just want to also inform you that opioid abuse does exist on the Navajo Nation. And so recently we had created an opioid task force team, and basically this is a collaboration with our Indian Health Service. We do have 5 facilities there on Navajo, and also our Public Law 93, 638 facilities, which we also have 5 there. And so basically we've been talking about how and what is opioid to the Navajo Nation. So our people there pretty much have a low health literacy rate in regards to understanding what's happening in the health field, and so that's where we've been talking about APSA and creation of educating our Navajo people. And so ways of opioids that are being used on Navajo, which we discuss, is the pill form, the smoking, the snorting, mixing with substances, and skin patches. And so basically we're working on a PSA again so that we can educate our Navajo people. And so one barrier we do have is our language. So Navajo language is very complex, and so it's a lot of descriptive details that we need to include while we're translating. And so we do have issues with funding there. So we do need and request for more funding so that we can be able to provide adequate services in educating our Navajo people. And so we do have distributors there on Navajo. So the main distributor is Indian Health Service and also our Public Law 638 facilities. And we do have border towns there, such as Flagstaff and Gallup, and so they do have their private distributors, such as Walmart, Walgreens, and Safeway, which we have no control of. So that's an issue for us. And so just also furthermore, requesting as far as tribal direct funding, it's very hard when the government sends money to the state and then it trickles to the tribes, and so there's restrictions and there's not enough funding. And so I just also want to make mention that IHS is underfunded, and so if we could get more funding to IHS to help us to fight opioid there with Navajo as well as Indian country. And so we have been talking with IHS, and what we do have is a strategic plan that's been shared with us. And so as part of the strategic plan is basically strengthening our public health data and reporting and collecting. So we want to focus on an actionable data for target intervention so that we can provide services. I just also want to make mention that with Navajo, one of our method of treatment is through our traditional native medicine. So we still do use our elders, we still use our cultural practices through prayers and songs and chants with our ceremonies, and that's very effective for us. And so we do also want that to be recognized as a form of method of treatment. Furthermore, just going on with our strategic plan, we have the advanced practice of pain management to enable access to high-quality, evidence-based pain care that decreases the burden of pain for individuals, families, and society, while also reducing them inappropriate use of opioids and opioid-related harms. And so again, going into the crime rate, we do have a high level of crime, underlying issues with domestic violence. We also have human trafficking there on Navajo because of opioid as well as other substances. And we want to improve access to patient as far as treatment, prevention, and recovery services, and so that we can prolong the life of each of our Navajo people. They are important to us. And we also want to target the availability and distribution of overdose, reversing medication to ensure the broad provisions of these drugs to people likely to experience or respond to an overdose, with a particular focus on targeting high-risk population. Also want to make mention that we also want to support cutting-edge research that advances our understanding of pain and addiction, that leads to development of new treatment and identifies effective public health interventions to decrease opioid. So right now, what we're basically doing is a lot of prevention education, and so we do have a collaboration with our community health representatives who also go out into the community and pretty much provide education in the Navajo language. And we also feel our Navajos learn more visually, and so they're out there with their charts, especially to our elders, and speaking, you know, what are the signs and the symptoms, what are some concerns, because a lot of our people who use opioids still live with their elderly parents, and so we want to inform the elderly parents because, again, it is a safety concern. We get a lot of elders who come to us and tell us that they're afraid of their adult children, especially when they're on any sort of influence as far as substances go. Also want to make mention that Navajo Nation President has made mention several times there in DC that the DEA needs to be involved, and that we feel as Navajo they need to place extreme restrictions on opioid. And basically that's what I wanted to share with you all. Thank you for this time.
Thank you, Dr. Segay. The chair now recognizes Ms. Moak for 5 minutes to testify.
Chairwoman McSally and distinguished members of Congress, thank you for having me here today. It's an honor. Generally, when we talk about opioid abuse or drug abuse in general, we think about 3 different buckets: supply, demand, and harm reduction strategies. I'm going to focus my comments primarily on demand and touch on harm reduction strategies. In the midst of an opioid epidemic, I want to see people find access to treatment to save lives while preventing the next generation from starting down this path. We must do both simultaneously. About a decade before we founded Not My Kid, drug abuse was the #1 issue on the minds of Americans. This country went to work and we made huge strides. In and from all sectors. Yes, it was law enforcement, but it was also everyone else too, including Hollywood, churches, sports professionals. This country knows how to take an issue like we've done with tobacco use seriously when it wants to. And in the late 1980s and early 90s, we did that. The results were nearly miraculous. We reduced drug abuse in this country by over 50% by 1993 when we got focused. And we did in this country what we too often do. We felt we solved it and we moved on. So we should look back to those years and look at those strategies of what worked. I will tell you this, we need to adopt those strategies and funding consistently and grind them out without gaps year after year. You know, too often I'm dismayed because I hear smart, responsible citizens tell me that it's impossible to turn back our drug use problem here in the U.S. And I say, you are wrong. It must start first with our will to do so. The mass poisoning of millions can be stopped with a serious effort. We have addressed drug crisis like crack cocaine, crystal meth, and now must employ similar strategies for the opioid epidemic. We actually know what to do. We've been here before, but every single American has a role to play. You know, yes, I said substance use because I don't just single out opioids, even in the midst of a crisis. America has a drug use problem. Of course, we see whatever is coming across our borders, what's coming through our postal system, and what's being produced here in America, that will trend what we're seeing. That ends up in our homes, and depending on what the supply is. Addressing demand or use of all substances needs to also be done simultaneously. That is the best evidence-based practice versus singling out one substance. And I want to share with you some effective programs that are happening here in Arizona that can be, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, pardon me, can be employed more widely. You know, our Arizona Youth Survey of 2016 is a roadmap for us. It tells us that youth use drugs for the following reasons and in order: to have fun, to feel good, to deal with stress, and to avoid being sad. In other words, youth want to alter how they feel. And sadly, adults have sent them many messages that impact that thinking. We've told kids that things like marijuana is medicine when we vote to change medicine to recreate with it. We see commercials every time we turn on the TV that tells us there's a fix for every feeling that we have. The survey also gives us a roadmap, however, for how to keep kids from using drugs. The top reasons why kids don't use drugs are it's of no interest to them, they understand the harmful effects, they don't want to disappoint their parents, and that they're illegal. These are all points of data. Arizona has a campaign, unlike the Just Say No campaign, Arizona has a campaign called, I call it a Just Say Yes campaign. Say yes to I've got something better to do. We connect youth to local opportunities in their counties to play sports, hike mountains, go to a concert, volunteer, and quite frankly, get re-engaged with their own families. We have to inspire kids to seek out their passions and dreams and help them to get there. When was the last time we've seen a great PSA or campaign continued not only throughout the year without interruption here in Arizona and certainly across the United States? We can do that, and Arizona already has a great campaign ready to be scaled. We also know that talking to our kids with an educated parent may reduce substance abuse by 50%. Yet the Arizona Youth Survey shows us that only 50% of 8th graders have had that conversation with a parent in the last year. 60% of seniors have not had that conversation with a parent in a year. Fix that. Focus on that. Mandatory parent, youth, and faculty involvement in prevention programming that educates youth, parents, and faculty at the same time exists here in Arizona. However, that program has great data provided by ASU on its reach, and we won't have funding for it next year. ESPER, one of the 56 Opioid Commission recommendations. Screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment. Yes, screen all high school students for mental health and substance use. 90% of all addiction occurs from what kids do during the teen years. That gives us our target and a bullseye. Screen youth during these years to support and intervene early when it's easy to turn the situation around, when it's least costly to youth and society. When we used to screen kids for things like vision or scoliosis, and when we screen all kids, it's not weird and no one gets singled out or stigmatized. When a kid, not my kid, has a program that is kids are being funneled there who've been caught with first youth, and it's tripled in a year in its size because schools are desperate for this need. It's called Project Rewind. So on first use of a kid, we work with them. Kids shouldn't be kicked out of school. We should help them and their families receive appropriate resources. Again, something else that already exists and we can scale. Youth feel loved and protected when adults set boundaries and offer support. Today's youth feel alone, isolated, and stressed more than ever. This is a place for adults to get educated and connect, and I'm letting you know that embedding behavioral health in our schools is key.
Ms. Moak, can you wrap up your
Oh, I'm
testimony?
so
We'll
sorry.
continue on with the questions.
Yes, ma'am. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
As you can see, I'm quite passionate. Then in closing, I will just say there are 5 things I'd like you to remember. Prevention is the healthiest and cheapest. The federal government must provide visible leadership to convene all parties. We must recognize behavioral health as important as education in school settings. We need ongoing public and private sector commitments, and we must make access to treatment available.
Thank you, Ms. Moak. The chair now recognizes Mr. Corey for 5 minutes to testify.
Thank you, Chairwoman McSally, and for the committee for allowing me to be here to share today. Arizona faces an epidemic of substance abuse that translates into staggering costs to our state. It's one of the leading causes of homelessness, poverty, crime, rising medical costs, incarceration, recidivism, repeat offenders, child removal, interstate custody, and family deterioration. I'm going to dispense from statistics, as we've heard plenty. The opiate crisis is a wake-up call. However, substance abuse, other addictions, negative behavioral manifestations such as violence and abuse continue to rise as well. Society continues to increase its desire for instant gratification, self-medication, and escape. The problem is greater than just availability of chemicals. Our society is declining spiritually. We've seen a breakdown of family, more fatherless households, growing number of those who cannot sustain themselves and afford the cost of living. The problem does not operate in isolation. There's a large underserved population of men, women, and families facing poverty, homelessness, and trauma in Arizona, and especially in the Phoenix metropolitan area. Poverty. There's over 1.1 million persons, or 16.4% of Arizona, below the poverty line. Homelessness. There's more than 37,000 persons experience homelessness in Arizona, and there may be as many as 8,900 homeless on any given night. In Maricopa County, there were 22,000 experiencing homelessness, or 54% of the state's total, with more than 5,600 on any given night. Lack of affordable housing. There is a grossly insufficient affordable housing in Arizona. It's often not safe and healthy. Many leave recovery programs or incarcerations and go right back to use because they can't afford to live. Recommended solutions. Phoenix Rescue Mission applauds the efforts to reduce supply and efforts towards prevention of substance abuse. Phoenix Rescue Mission also supports the efforts of Medicaid-assisted treatments to reduce cravings for and effects of opiates. There is an immediate, drastic need for increased capacity for cost-effective, comprehensive residential and non-residential programs that provide pathways out of poverty, homelessness, addiction, and other life-controlling problems. Most need more than temporary relief for short-term programs and are unprepared for direct placement into housing. The program should include a crisis component, a crisis stabilization, get people out of situations that they're in, bring them to a safe place where they could be assessed and properly placed. There needs to be a drastic increase in comprehensive recovery programs, both short and long-term. Comprehensive meaning that had case management services, academic assistance, English as a second language, vocational development, job placement, spiritual growth, counseling. Reentry, there needs to be expanded capacity for housing and support services for persons completing residential work. Recommended solution, work in partnership with faith-based providers. Example, Association of Gospel Rescue Missions. Phoenix Rescue Mission is a member of the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions. There are 7 member missions in Arizona. Now in its 105th year, the association is North America's oldest and largest network of independent crisis shelters and rehabilitation centers. Each year, AGRM's members serve more than 65 million meals, 24 million nights of lodging, 36,000 people find independent housing, and they assist about 45,000 people in finding employment. 17,000 people from addiction recovery programs are placed into productive living. Just a little experience, recent experience from the Phoenix Rescue Mission. The first step into admission into our residential program is called RAP, which is a 7-day triage program. Statistics for the last 10 months, ending April 30th, we admitted 542 unduplicated men. The top 3 presenting problems were homelessness, financial crisis, and substance abuse. The top disclosed drugs of choice for substance abuse were alcohol, stimulants, cannabis, and opiates. Opiates were 38%. 392 or 72% of the men were successfully placed in appropriate solution programming, with 254 or 47% being placed in our first phase of our recovery program. People are getting off the streets and they're getting plugged into treatment programs. On the women's side, we had 217 unduplicated women, same basic breakdown of presenting problems with a 40% opiate. The rest, so we're out on the streets. A couple anecdotal points. Because of our street teams that go out on the street, we have 2 vans out there every day. They're younger. Heroin obviously is increasing as a drug of choice. It's less expensive. We're seeing that the prescriptions, the results of our efforts to reduce prescription on meds on the street is taking effect, because they are becoming more expensive. However, people are turning to a more cheaper alternative, such as heroin. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Thank you, Mr. Corey. The chair now recognizes Mr. Warner for 5 minutes to testify.
Thank you, Congressman McSally and Ranking Member Grijalva. I want to thank the distinguished members of the subcommittee for allowing us to come today. I also want to thank the current and past panels for all of the efforts. It's an absolute honor to represent Teen Challenge of Arizona today as a graduate of the program. Like Mr. Corey, I will also be dispensing from statistics and simply share my personal experience with addiction. My name is Wayne Warner, and I am the Dean of Men at the Teen Challenge Christian Life Ranch in New River, Arizona. Miraculously, I am an ex-opioid addict that has had the pleasure of not only testifying today, but also being alive after an extensive period of illicit drug use took me down a path of misery and discontent. My story begins at 16 years old when a conflict at school left me with the ring and pinky appendage of my left hand severed after a door was closed on them. I cite this experience not for the trauma nor the pain, but the pain management I received from my injury. I was a 16-year-old handed narcotics to take when I needed them, quote unquote, to manage the pain in my hand. I remember this experience vividly, and I still refer to this as the day I first felt okay with myself. Although I so enjoyed this feeling, the thought of becoming a drug addict truly terrified me to my core. It would take a few years for my addiction to truly take over my life. After a seemingly slow graduation from marijuana to pills again, and then eventually heroin, I found myself homeless, jobless, and nearly lifeless. I had been arrested several times, charged with felonies, and sent on my way time and time again. I was an angry, injured shell of a human being, attempting to carry around the fragmented pieces of my life from rehab to rehab until I could get enough rest to find the energy to wake up and do it all over again. Life at this point was meaningless, and people were pointless. Love was an idea, abandoned and buried in the cemetery with my relationships with my family and friends. People would die around me, and I felt like the lone sailor in the sea waiting for the shark of addiction to come up and ambush me from beneath, but I was not afraid of him. I was afraid that I would have to wake up when the sun rose and the slow and painful torture of withdrawal would begin to set in once again. I was arrested for the last time October 28, 2012, after I stole a vehicle from the family member of a friend in order to pick up a bag of heroin with the last $20 I had to my name. As I spoke through the bars of the back window of the Peoria Police Tahoe, I recall giving my mother's name and her number to my friend, asking him to tell her I was arrested once again and to please just leave me in jail this time. Excuse me.
Doing great.
Unbeknownst to me, on that very same day, 2 men from the Christian Life Ranch in New River, Arizona would knock on the door of a woman's house that desperately needed her son to get help. They gave their testimonies, prayed with her, and promised her that they would pray for her son to get the help he needed. That woman's name is Tammy, and she is my mother. I was sentenced, I served my time, and I was released. I was ordered that one of the conditions of my probation would be the completion of the Teen Challenge program. I was also made clear to me that in the state of Arizona, I would then and always carry the legal label of felon indefinitely. Over the following years, a few major milestones would be achieved in my life. Teen Challenge and adult probation were completed. I committed to and completed an internship at the ranch and was later hired on as a full-time employee. This might sound like every other redemptive story that you've heard, and you might be partially correct. There is one thing that makes me different, and that is the fact that I have had my immediate family and my Teen Challenge family behind me every step of the way. They never gave up. They never put me down, and they never stopped loving me. I was baptized, affirmed, counseled, and unconditionally loved. I owe a debt of gratitude not only to both my family and my program, but also to Jesus Christ, my personal Lord and Savior. If it weren't for these relationships being so strong and dependable, I would not be where I am today. My life has now exponentially improved. I get to be part of a team of leaders that is spearheading the effort to discuss and resolve the real-life issues that people like me have dealt with and some of us have died because of. I'm sought after for guidance, support, and even advice. I will be celebrating 6 years of sobriety this October. I will be celebrating, I will be celebrating my 1-year anniversary with my wife, Kendra, this June. And we will be celebrating the birth of our newborn baby boy in July. It's through the program of Teen Challenge, programs like it, the people that work there, and the grace of God that I am able to speak in front of you today. There is hope for the epidemic our country and our world is currently facing, and that hope is found in love. Thank you, and God bless.
Wow. Thank you, Mr. Warner, for your courage to share your personal story with us. It's pretty powerful. Mr. Schweikert needs to leave, so I'm now going to recognize him first for questions.
And thank you for that. Being raised by a woman who spent much of her later adult life in a 12-step program and then became a substance abuse counselor right down the street here, trying to recruit drug-addicted prostitutes off the street. It's you don't sometimes, for all of us, process the human tragedy substance abuse can be. I have to leave in a moment, but I do have, Dr. Chris, just because it bothered me but also was optimistic. You made a comment that we have a 50% reduction in high-volume prescriptions for opioids.
Yes.
For the remaining 50%, how much of that is the proper term Paladin? Of the remaining 50%?
So that would be through our controlled substances prescription monitoring program. What we're doing is the 90. A lot of it's going to be pain management.
That's actually where I'm
Yes.
going. Look, we've all will have this issue in our lives, someone that's in hospice, or
Right.
those things. In that case, there is going to be pain management. My concern is 50% reduction is miraculous.
Right.
What of that remaining 50% is still bad actors, and what of that is just what should be the baseline in our society? Do you have, and I know I'm asking you to speculate, but you're bathing in the data.
Right. We can go back and look. That's a very interesting question. I don't know that I have the specifics because we would have to go back and match medical records and things.
It's hard, but that's actually one of the things I'm after is if we're making an argument that opioids are different than other types of addictions in our society, that this gateway comes through our medical profession, so the demographics are different. The population looks different than often the youth and other types. But of our populations, how many should be there? And if it's only another 10% or so, we need to solve that other 40%, if I'm making sense.
Absolutely.
And what do we do as federal policymakers? You know, I'm working on a technology piece that does a prior authorization, and that's bipartisan. That will move through. But is it a technology solution? Is it a data solution? Is it a human solution? Help us find one. And with that, Madam Chairman, I yield back, and forgive me, I must leave.
Absolutely. Dr. Chris, do you want to reply at all?
I would say it's probably all three. So it's probably going to be a technology solution, a data solution, and a human solution. But out of concern for those that do need it through hospice or end of life or palliative care, that has been exempted, and they're not required to stick to the dose restrictions in the legislation.
What we need to understand is how much of our population prescription usage is that population, and then the rest we need to analyze and understand.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Mr.
Thank you,
Stricker.
gang.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the acting ranking member, Mr. Grijalva, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And let me, first of all, Mr. Warner, thank you for sharing with us and everybody your journey. Very difficult as it was, there is a light, and I appreciate you taking the time to be with us today and share that. Dr. Chris, I was going to ask you a couple, at the beginning of my opening statement, I said I wish that somebody from the pharmaceutical industry was here. And the reason is that there's no question in terms of linkage that much of what we're dealing with right now with this opioid crisis began with the prescription painkillers that became part and parcel, and now you see an increase in heroin and phenethol as substitutes for that. And one of the reasons is a question, Noxolin, was his life-saving overdose drug that, interestingly enough, in 2014 it was $288 for an injector. Right now it's over about $2,000 for an injector. It's gone proportionally higher. I think that somebody recognized the market. And when local communities, and particularly law enforcement and public health officials, are attempting to get a hold of this as a life-saving opportunity to have out there, the price has been raised. And so I think they needed to be part of this. If you had $76 billion to spend on the opioid crisis nationwide, where would you prioritize the money? What would be your first priority?
I think going back to Mrs. Moak, a response, I think this has to be a two-pronged approach. I think you need to provide access to treatment and improve the ability for patients that are currently suffering from opioid use disorder to have access to the treatment they need. But I think in order to respond and deal with this in the future, you really have to have targeted prevention and harm reduction efforts. And so I would donate the money.
Yeah, because one of the studies showed that since 2000, that the cost of the crisis, opioid crisis, has been $1 trillion, and that in the next 3 years it could be $500 billion. And so I appreciate your answer, because I think that's one of the focus that we need to have when we talk about this. In a report, well, I'll go back to some other point later. Mr. McCoy, in your experience in dealing with the fine work you do, particularly outreach and retrieving people to try to provide support, I'm glad you brought up the issue of poverty and other things that are part of the contributing factor that we don't talk about enough. Do you believe that the majority of opioid users started out on heroin and fentanyl? Yeah, fentanyl.
We are dealing with people that are actually right off the streets, people that are coming into our RAP unit, which is more like a social detox. And I think that there has been a heroin problem for a very long time. There has been a substance abuse problem for a very long time. I would say that there has been an adjustment in the population. We're seeing a new element enter into the population. Again, we're focused sort of at the bottom of the safety net, and that there are younger people.
I need to ask what?
Younger people that, because of opiate addiction, because of prescription med addiction, fell into heroin addiction. And so they're younger. There's a lot more females on the street than there used to be. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
You did, absolutely. Ms. Bach, in the limited time that I have, your testimony, I think, did a great job of explaining why prevention is so important and the various techniques that we can be employed to fight substance abuse of all forms. We're dealing with the opioid crisis in this hearing. Where does border security funding fall as a prevention strategy to end the demand for drugs in this country? And how do we reconcile the proposed balancing cuts and cuts in general to nutrition, housing, Medicaid, Medicare, community development in terms of the efforts at prevention?
No, I think that's a great question. Certainly, that is a prevention, not having these drugs come across our borders. But for me, I like scaling what's most cost-effective and makes the most sense, and that is not seeing our youth get started using any type of drug. We have this crisis right now. We've had others before. We will have others after this. So working in the schools and scaling, quite frankly, behavioral health right now in our school settings is a great use of funds.
And Dr. Segay and others, my time's up, but I have written questions, and I appreciate Dr. Segay bringing a perspective that sometimes at these hearings is not heard often enough. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Now I yield to myself in place of Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Warner, thanks for sharing your personal story, and congratulations on your coming birth of your daughter. It's exciting and hopeful, and I think with some decisions you made and what may have been intended for evil, God has used for good. That's in right. Your redemptive path. And so I'm really proud of your courage to be able to share that story and invest into others. If you could talk to your 16-year-old self and look back at that moment in time. You obviously had an injury. You were in pain. What would you advise be done differently, both within your choices and those around you, whether it's the doctor or others in your life, friends and family, in order to have you go on a different path?
I am so glad that I have an opportunity to speak more than just my testimony, because I have a lot of opinions on this stuff, and so I just appreciate just this moment in time. So first off, as Ms. Moak was speaking about, preventative measures have to be taken. We actually do a segment called Stay Sharp, where we go into middle schools, high schools, and elementary schools, and we give our testimonies to adolescent children. And the teachers come up to us after and say, hey, can you stay back and talk to this one person that I really feel needs help? And what that tells me is two things. This person doesn't have anybody to talk to at home, and they don't have anybody to talk to at school. And the teacher doesn't know what to do. until we just show up out of the blue and they think, oh, I'm so happy you guys are here. Now this person can speak, but we have a limited amount of time. And so having a representative from some type of organization that is in the school that has a personal relationship with these adolescents would be monumental in terms of being able to sense where a person is and how they can help, number one. Number two, $76 billion. If we had that, just being able to fund that type of thing inside of public schools and private schools, not only are you going to see the addiction start to drop because we're heading it off, we're nipping it in the bud before it can even get to this epidemic. But then also, supply is meeting demand right now. And as long as you have demand, you will get supply. So you can take, and I don't want to diminish the task forces that we've heard from today whatsoever, but the fact is all of the drugs that they've taken off the streets, I did not have an issue finding them. I'm letting you know right now. It wasn't like, hey, guess what, there was a big bust, we're not going to get high today, unfortunately. And I hate to be crass, but that is the reality. It was never an impact. So that's what I would have liked to know, is that there was somebody there that understood me and that cared about me, to answer your question.
Thanks, Mr. Warner. As we've seen from this panel, we've got now both two faith-based organizations, not $1 of government funding, right, that are changing lives and impacting lives, a nonprofit that is also involved and engaged. Not every school needs to have the Teen Challenge visitors. Not every school is going to be able to have Not My Kid, but the complementary nature of all of what you're doing, combined with an appropriate government role, I think is really what's come out of this panel a lot, right? It has to be all the above. Is there any sort of collaboration of coordination among the nonprofits with the government, Dr. Chris, related to, hey, we're focused over here, but there's really an issue in this geographic area, or we need to be doing more on the reservations and cooperating, get some nonprofits coming in there? Is there some way for there to be that collaboration in order to address this and identify where the needs are? So it's all of the above strategy.
So I think that's a fantastic question. And through the Governor's Goal Council, we did try to bring together stakeholders, whether they were patients, associations, faith-based, nonprofits. But I think one of the biggest assets that the governor has is the Governor's Office of Youth, Faith, and Family, because they do a fantastic job convening those organizations and getting funding to them. And I'll yield to Ms.
Ms. Moak, and then I want to ask Dr. Segay something really quick.
So in fact, since I've left the governor's office, that's exactly what I'm working on. We know that federal state funds will never be enough to solve this. One small example, I'm currently working with Blue Cross Blue Shield, and their bottom line was, we want to fund what you're already doing.
Right.
We don't want to start something from scratch. So we're taking a look at all the initiatives we already have that have data, and bringing in more private sector like Blue Cross Blue Shield to scale.
Thanks. Dr. Segay, Indian Health Services is obviously critical on the reservation. Are there other, though, nonprofits or others that would be, culturally acceptable to be able to partner with and help on the reservation for those that are struggling with addiction? And are they present there?
Thank you for your question, Madam Chair. So the reality there on Navajo is that we've been trying to pretty much demonstrate the effectiveness as far as method of treatment with traditional services, and it's been hard. So we don't have no evidence-based as far as what ceremonies are effective or disciplined, so we have what's effective-based. And so right now, all of our ceremonies, our traditional methods with our traditional practitioners are not reimbursable.
Right.
So it's really complicated to say, here's an evidence-based ceremony that needs to be reimbursed. So in reality, we've been going to CMS and letting them know that, this needs to be reimbursable. Pretty much, it just connects to everything. So collaboration is happening among our tribal programs, our public laws, 93-638 facilities, and IHS as far as their satellite, and then the tribal program. So keeping in mind that Navajo is 27,000 square feet with 350 enrolled members. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm totally out of time, Mr. Corey. I wanted to ask you a question, but I want to respect everyone's time. So the chair now recognizes Mr. Gallego for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Moak, I actually missed it, but I was looking through your testimony. You mentioned a program that was run out of U of A that ran out of funds. Can you refresh my memory on that?
Yes, sir. It was actually a program that was evaluated by ASU. The program was a prevention program that we designed the curriculum, scaled it for the past 2 years into 7th grade, has great data, was loved by students, parents, and faculty. It was very affordable and easy to scale, and literally we don't have funding for it this coming year.
And so why don't you have funding for it this coming year?
The grants change from year to year.
And the grants were coming from the federal government, the state government?
Yes, sir.
Which
It was a federal
department was
grant.
it?
Do you recall the Healthy Families, Healthy Youth, Kara? I apologize, I'm blanking on that right now.
Okay.
But the grant is not available to us next year.
If you could provide that information to my office,
Yes, sir, I will.
I'd greatly appreciate it. Director Chris, you heard my comments earlier to the Governor Ducey, and as someone, as you, who is very knowledgeable on Medicaid, and someone who, like me, who actually really is proud of access here in Arizona, I am concerned that there is a missing link here among our Arizona government, including the governor, that they don't actually quite understand how important Medicaid is to preventing both opioids and addiction. Could you just give us some example of how helpful Medicaid expansion can be in terms of dealing with our opioid epidemic?
So, given the 5-minute limitation, I think that's a
I'll give you 2
fantastic-
minutes of the 5
Yes.
minutes.
Okay. I think that I didn't get to highlight how engaged access in the Medicaid program has been in Arizona's response. So we have partnered with Director Butlock and his team. They are responsible for administering the $24 million state targeted response grant that came through SAMHSA last year. They are actually integrating that into the Medicaid program so that our substance abuse patients and those that are suffering from opioid use disorder get the same services, and especially for that $10 million funding that they found for the uninsured and underinsured, that will be partnered with our access program. So it's actually, we are using Medicaid in Arizona as the base for expanding our medication-assisted treatment and our treatment options.
And to switch gears, in terms of FQHCs, I'm really bad with acronyms, Federal Qualified Health Clinics, there's been a severe cut in terms of funding for FQHCs, which deals with a lot of that population. Do you see good investments in terms of putting money back into FQHCs in terms of trying to curb the cost or curb the human costs of the opioid epidemic?
Absolutely. I think that luckily in Arizona, we have a very strong partnership with our FQHCs and their association, so we are utilizing them. They are a perfect resource. They are statewide. They provide whole person integrated care and would be they are a great partner for our opioid use disorder patients.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Chris. Dr. Segay, as you know, the opioid epidemic's impact on Indian country has been quite profound. Fully 10% of Native children have used opioids for non-medical purposes, which is double the rate of Anglo children. So in addition, Native women who are pregnant are nearly 9 times more likely to be diagnosed with opioid dependency or abuse compared to the general population. This epidemic has also strained tribal governments that are already facing significant challenges in general. In the face of so much suffering, what can we do as a federal government to step in? And I particularly ask because I am going to be the incoming chairman of Indian Affairs next year, and would like to make sure that I'm ready and prepared to be helping out Indian country.
Thank you for that.
Don't jinx it.
And so, well, on Navajo, a lot of times we pretty much always try to educate our leaders. And so we request and always make the request to our leaders in Washington, federal level, to come visit Navajo so that they can understand and see how our healthcare delivery system is set up. Because we have miles, so for example, it would take, in some areas, it's 100 miles to the nearest facility.
Yeah.
And we don't have helicopter service, or even our safety response, is like 2-3 hours response. So that's where there's the golden hour, and that's where we lose a lot of our people, especially, say, for example, if there's an opioid overdose.
Not to take too much time,
Sure.
It is certainly a problem dealing with East Coast politicians. They don't understand the concept of a Native American reservation, because over there, theirs is the size of a stamp, and ours are our tribal lands are the size of states, comparatively to the East Coast. So I do agree that we need to have that education for them.
Yes, and more funding for IHS. Thank you.
100%. I like how you got that in under the wire, too. Thank you so much. Thank you for all your testimony.
All right, gentlemen's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Ms. Lesko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, panel, for everything that you do for our community. What's become clear to me in this whole hearing today is we need a multifaceted approach, which we are taking to solve this opioid crisis and drug abuse crisis. And I really thank you, Mr. Corey, for your work that you do in the community, Mr. Warner, for sharing your story. I hope you continue sharing your story. It's very inspirational, very touching. What a success story. Thanks for sharing it. I have a really kind of common sense, basic question, no statistics, anything like that. This is something that comes up, and I quite frankly want to know the answer and see what your insight is. And that is, I see a huge increase in panhandlers. It seems like on the streets. My district includes Sun City, and I'm starting to see panhandlers on the streets in Sun City on Grand Avenue, which hasn't taken, this hadn't happened before. And the number of homeless, too, it really seems to be increasing. And so my first question is, do you think that the increase in panhandlers is due to drug addiction? Are they trying to get money for drug addiction? And my follow-up question is, as an individual who's compassionate, should I give them money or should I not? And maybe all of you can answer it, but I have a feeling that Mr. Corey and Mr. Warner probably are the best ones to answer those questions.
This is a rescue referral card, which we will come pick you up. We will give you free food. We will take care of you. We will do, so do not give them money, is my counsel.
I'm going to get a bunch of your cards.
All right, I got a bunch of them with me. Be happy to share them with you. So yes, there's an increase in panhandling. There is an increase in homelessness. All right, so you see it West Coast. What I see on the West Coast really scares me. It's not in our statistics yet, I don't believe, but there is people that are in Phoenix that actually came from San Diego and different places now. It's a mess over there. Addiction is 70%, in my opinion. That's because it's complicated with dual diagnosis, but certainly 70% substance abuse on the streets. That's my opinion. People will disagree with that. And I have many clients that are successful coming up through our program that were panhandlers for years. It's a good business. I can get up in the morning, I get on the, I want one individual I'll refer to in Scottsdale. Got up in the morning from his camp, got on public transportation, went to his spot, and worked long enough to achieve a target dollar amount so he could get his fix and some food, and he went and got high until the next day, and he repeated it all over. So panhandling is a good business. I'm not saying it's all that way for everybody. Now, we actually have some efforts that are in motion to, we are launching soon a homeless to work program that will actually be targeted at giving panhandlers the opportunity to work for the day. But yes, I think it's very much related to substance abuse.
Yeah, so Phoenix Rescue Mission, this isn't a secret. This is something that that they all know about. I want to say all. I want to be very careful with that. The majority of people that are looking for help know about Phoenix Rescue Mission. They know about Teen Challenge. They know about these other organizations that want to help them. What you're seeing is somebody that's more than likely avoiding the help in order to do what they want to do. My advice as a compassionate person, and the practice that my wife and I have employed in our relationship, is if we run into somebody that seems as if they're in need, we ask them what their specific need is, and we take that person, either take them to go and get it, or we get that thing for them and bring it to them. We don't give them currency, we don't give them things like that, because if they have a specific need, we'll take care of that. You know, if you need gas in your car, we'll go get you gas. If you need a meal, we'll get you a meal. But in terms of just cold hard cash, it's not necessary, in my opinion.
Yields back.
I yield back.
All right. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses. I know we didn't get into all the solutions, and I'm grateful for your time and your passion on this issue. If we have other questions, we'll ask them in writing, and we'd ask if you could respond to them in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Okay, thank you.